Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to the School District of Springfield Township Board of School Directors, regular board meeting, February 21st, 2017. Let's all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Reading of the mission statement. The mission of the School District of Springfield Township is to educate and develop all students as learners and citizens who are high-achieving, resilient, and responsible in a changing global community. Roll call, Mr. King.
Mr. Chapman. Ms. Casalis.
Here.
Mr. Lapidus. Here. Ms. Nelson. Mr. Rayer. Ms. Sarsfield. Dr. Taratuski. Here. Mr. Taylor. Here. Ms. Slapinski.
Here. Announcements. The board, at its discretion, may videotape all or any portion of public board meetings subject to the limitations set forth in Policy 006.2, broadcasting of meetings. Board meetings will be broadcast on Friday afternoon following the board meeting. Are there any public comments on agenda items? Okay.
Mr. Rubin.
Hi.
Hi, good evening. And if you would please just give us your name and your address.
Sure. My name is Scott Rubin. I live at 302 T Road in Glenside with my wife and 2 children. My daughter goes to school she's in 5th grade here. And we always look forward to, they do, receiving your messages. You're well known in my household and well appreciated. But thank you very much for your time. I wanted to come here just to spend a few minutes. I don't have a prior background here at all, so this is my first time. I learned tonight on my way home that there was a interest in developing some fields at the high school using artificial turf. In the course of my work for my employer, a large insurance company, I work in the corporate underwriting department there. Happen to do a lot of research. I'm not an industrial hygienist. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a lawyer. I've worked with I've read, maybe 150 cases in the course of doing research on different things. And, I gather that you're trying to juggle, what to do in terms of whether or not to use artificial turf, right? So I understand there might be some economic benefits to using it, and there might also be some use benefits to it as well in terms of having fields used for multiple purposes without the need for additional maintenance in between uses. And I think that's great. My concern relates to the health hazard risks associated with artificial turf. And I can't get up here and cite any specific scientific studies for you because I don't have any. The little that I knew about this and I had tagged in my personal files was stuff for me to think about as I go about my work in my daytime pursuits. And the 1 or 2 things I'd sort of raise for your consideration as you go about this are these 2 things. This is what one could call an emerging risk. An emerging risk in the insurance industry is a risk about which you really don't know very much, and you have it making a decision on it, whether to use it or not use it, to insure it or not insure it, and if so, under what terms and conditions, is very difficult. And I get that, and I understand that. Companies have a vested interest in selling their commercial products. And history is replete with cases of companies not doing the right thing, even when they knew the health hazard issues. It's replete with it, and you can look back over history and find cases. And if you're interested, I can share some of those with you, but that would be tangential in some sense here. So I wanted to give that as some background for you to think about as you go about making your decisions. Ultimately, one of we're guardians of our children's, care, in their health and well-being, in their physical, their emotional, their social, their academic. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but are making sure that we do nothing to really put them unnecessarily at risk, even if it's in the interest of more field space, and I mean that respectfully, or saving money is really a preeminent thing. One of the things that when people get into litigation, around things like, is this hazardous or not? Should someone be held responsible for it? And I'm not lobbying for any of that. But one of the issues in legal speak, and I'm not an attorney, is whether there's something called general causation. General causation is the idea that a specific substance or material can be harmful to somebody or can cause some injurious result, right? So, take, anything that you might be concerned about. Silica. Silica, for example, is a known carcinogen, right? And it can cause all sorts of bad things, but they can take decades and decades to manifest. And we're all familiar with the NFL stuff, right? And what the NFL did, just as a recent example of knowing but not being transparent about things. And about things like how, coming up with CTE, cumulative traumatic encephalopathy, right, which is kind of a hallmark bad guy for NFL players, and some good number of pros have killed themselves for this, and takes decades to find out. There's now research going on that says, yeah, maybe you can detect these tau proteins early. But emerging risk is stuff that's elusive, and it takes a long time to figure out. That's one main point, right? Two is general causation is it takes a long time to get your arms around that. Oftentimes there's not agreement within the scientific community regarding whether there is, in fact, general causation. And you can get different experts saying different things, right? And there are all these legal principles and rules about who's admissible when it comes to witness, right? You have to have certain credentials and this and that. And the other thing is specific causation. So you need to also prove specific causation, which means that not only is silica perhaps in general carcinogenic, but the silica in this product or used in that process was actually the cause of one or more individuals, deleterious, harmful reaction, right? And that's even harder to prove. And so, again, I don't have any specific studies to offer you. We're guardians of our kids' well-being, and I'd encourage you to reconsider the use of this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Rudin, and I don't know whether it was intentional on your part or not to be here this evening, but okay, because the presentation that we have this evening, you mentioned transparency, and in the interest of transparency, we have asked a scientific toxicologist to come along with one representative from one company representing turf installation. The purpose of having a toxicologist here is really to talk about the inherent risks and also to offer community members an opportunity to ask questions, to cite concerns, and so forth. So that's really our reason for having this presentation this evening. I can assure you that this is part of the due diligence that we are conducting, not only in terms of evaluating the pros and cons simply of installation of turf, but also in our investigation of which products we believe might be appropriate should we decide that we're definitively going in that direction.
I understand, and thanks very much. And the only thing I'd say is I respect everything you said, Dr. Hacker. At the same time, recognizing where different people come from is also critical in the equation. And thank you very much. I do appreciate it.
Thank you for coming tonight.
So this evening, I propose that we do something a little bit different. We have a few presentations we want to get to, and we have a limited amount of agenda items to vote on, as well as a limited amount of board members with us. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to explain what we're proposing for the vote this evening.
Because our fifth vote is on the speakerphone, Ms. Casalis, who has been unable to be here this evening. And in light of the fact that we have a number of people who are here for the presentation, what we are proposing to do is all of our intended business in one motion. So the motion that we would be requesting that the board act on initially would be motion to approve the agenda items consisting of the approval of minutes, the approval of the treasurer's report, the approval of the reports and information of the parties, as well as the approval of the new business motions, including the recommended personnel motions, the Dewey Engineering long-term contract proposal, and the confidential settlement and release as presented. So that would require a motion to that effect, a second, and the board can act collectively on all of those items in one motion for the sake of efficiency.
So is there a motion to proceed? Second? Second? Okay. Okay, Mr. King?
Ms. Casalis.
Aye.
Mr. Lapidus. Aye. Dr. Taratuski. Aye. Mr. Taylor. Aye. Ms. Lipinski.
Aye. Thank you. Now we're going to move on to reports and information. The district PTA report, Naeem Moore.
How you doing? For those who don't know me, my name is Naeem Moore. I am one of the co-chairs of the EEHSP. Tonight I just wanted to go over some fundraising things that we have in the works for the rest of the year and one event. The first event we have coming up, which is on March 3rd, it's at the talent show. It's going to take place at Erdenheim Elementary, 7:00 p.m. This is our second show. We've done this for many years, and it's always been a pleasure to see the young kids act and perform, I should say. Next, we have book fairs coming up. So we have one at Enfield and one at Erdenheim. They're going to be 2 separate weeks. Enfield will be from March 13th to the 17th, and Erdenheim will be February 27th, which is next week, to the 3rd. And our next fundraiser is a flapjack fundraiser, which is going to be on Saturday, March 25th at the Applebee's in North Wells. It'll run from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., and tickets are $7. Information will go out to the elementary schools and within the next week. We have our annual carnival coming up on May 20th. It's a Saturday. It'll take place at Enfield again. You'll hear more information about that coming out soon. And we have booked the date for the Wizards and Spartan Fest, which is our food truck event. And last school year, or the beginning of this school year, was the first year that we actually did the Wizards game. And it was a huge success. We're going to continue it again. It's October 7th, and it'll take place in the high school gym. And then the last fundraiser that we are working on is for next school year is a cookbook fundraiser. It's something that a lot of families have talked about for a while, and we are trying to see if we can bring it to fruition. There's so many different ideas, the way to do a cookbook fundraiser and how to include not just the elementary schools, but the districts or the teachers or the students. So there's so many factors in there that we're trying to narrow down, not to have it a whole novel, but to have it a book that we can continue to do every year. So information will be coming out most likely the end of the school year or the beginning of next school year. So that's something that we're excited about for making a new fundraiser next year. Any questions on any of the fundraisers? Thank you for the opportunity. You guys have a good night.
Thanks so much. I don't believe we're going to be having a Finance Committee report. So now we'll move on to the administrative report. Dr. Nancy Hacker.
And I'm going to very quickly turn it over to Dave Schrader from Schrader Group Architects and Harry Petoni to introduce our guests for the evening. I know that everyone's looking forward to their presentation.
You want me to do that? Good evening. So tonight, as part of the design process, what we've started out with the high school, we wanted an opportunity to look a little more in depth at the field, and the thought proposed design of adding turf to the stadium at this point. So with us tonight, we have two presentations. Bill Bamber from Field Turf, one of the manufacturers that we're looking at and considering for the field, and Mike Preston, toxicologist, who will talk a little bit in depth regarding the makeup and composition of the field material and some of the health concerns that I know both the board and the community have asked for and asked some questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill first, and he could introduce himself and the company.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I'm Bill Bamber with Field Turf. My presentation is going to be pretty brief here because I feel that Mike's presentation is what most people have a vested interest in, right? Your children are going to be playing on this field possibly. These fields are located all over the area. I actually have a field at Arcadia University and also at Upper Dublin High School, so very close proximity to here, so many of your children may have already been playing on these fields. Field Turf is the largest synthetic turf manufacturer and installer in the world. We have over 10,000 fields in the ground. We have a 500,000 foot manufacturing plant down in Calhoun, Georgia, where all of our products are made. There are some safety studies out there, one in particular that we like to point to that was done by a Dr. Myers. And Dr. Myers was originally at Montana State, and he is now at Idaho State. This study was done at the high school and college level over a 5-year period. It actually has continued on and will be done over a 10-year period. But basically, what the study tells us is that on synthetic turf with 9-pound infill systems, that is 9 pounds of sand and rubber per square foot, and that's the system that we are proposing for the stadium, those fields are in line with what the injury rate is while playing football and also soccer on natural grass. So Dr. Meyer's study, to give you a little bit of background on it, took injuries reported during games that were contact injuries and non-contact injuries. And they were reported by the team trainer for the high school or the university where the injuries were recorded, and they were bandied out versus these same schools when they played on natural grass. And what they found was systems with 9 pounds or more per square foot of sand and rubber infill played exactly like natural grass. His study was peer-reviewed and published in the American Journal for Sports Medicine. The American Journal for Sports Medicine rejects 99 out of 100 studies that are submitted for peer review and for publication. So it's a very serious journal where many, many doctors are trying to get their studies published. Dr. Myers happened to be 1 out of 100 that was studied in this nationally recognized journal. This study was done by a county in Maryland. Montgomery County, Maryland has a public-private partnership where they have installed dozens of synthetic turf fields in Montgomery County. And they have a public-private partnership with local soccer companies and local lacrosse teams, things of that nature. So they rent their fields out. And what they found was they did a cost analysis over 20 years. And the net cost per use in an hour is what we really like to point out. It's about $22 per hour to use a synthetic turf field versus if you're playing on sand-based Bermuda, which is the best field in the world to play on, it's a natural grass field, that's about $140 per hour of use. Kentucky Bluegrass, which is what is at the Lincoln Financial Field where the Philadelphia Eagles play, hours per use is about $175. So you can see that synthetic turf is actually about 4 times less expensive to play on and maintain than what you would find on a natural grass field. This slide I feel is important because you're making a significant investment into any synthetic turf field that you install on your campus. So you can see here that we have about 4,000 fields that are between 8 and 10 years old. So we give you an 8-year warranty with your field. For this particular project, you're requesting a 10, which we will grant. So your product is going to, run the gamut of lasting a lifetime here. So in the ground, as I said, we have over 10,000 fields, but many of them, about 4,000 of them, are between 8 and 10 years old. This is just a photo of what your stadium field could look like. This is Ohio State University, one of our high-end customers. University of Notre Dame, which was grass forever, and they went to synthetic turf about 3 years ago. This is another high school. This is a soccer field. So I want to open it up to any questions at this point, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mike because he has the really, really important stuff regarding the material that is actually in the field and any health-related risks that may be out there. No questions?
You said it's warranty for 10 years?
Yes.
So in the event that, if I'm remembering correctly, the intent is, one, to improve the fields for the schools. Two is there's always somebody looking for a field to get on. So if these fields are overused and they wear out in 6 years, which is happening to some fields, what happens? The turf gets replaced in 6 years at no cost to the school district?
We actually have replaced fields that were not through their 8-year warranty period or their 10-year warranty period. In this case, we've replaced them at no cost to the customer, yes.
What is the initial cost of installing this?
The initial cost for a field depends on what is called stormwater management. You've done a lot of construction in this area, so you're probably used to hearing stormwater management. Little story background about stormwater management. My daughter goes to Villa Maria Academy in Malvern. Typically, I've been in this business for 15 years. We used to be able to install 6 inches of stone underneath the field, and that would cover your stormwater management. My daughter's field was installed in October of 2014. We had to put 4 feet of stone underneath that field at Villa Maria Academy to cover for the stormwater management. So that added significantly to the cost of the project. So anywhere from about $1.2 to $2 million will cover your installation, depending on what your stormwater management cost you. And that is out of our control. That is up to your county conservation district. So we don't make the rules with regards to stormwater management. As I said, we can make your field drain and operate correctly with 6 inches of stone, but I have seen cases where we've gone to 4 feet.
So if we leave it alone without putting in artificial turf, we don't put it out that $1.2 million or whatever, and we just have to pay for maintenance of the turf thereafter, the regular normal turf.
Right, you have to pay for maintenance on your natural grass, which involves cutting, seeding.
Yeah, but what would that cost over a 10-year period?
Over a 10-year period, I don't have that slide with me, but I can get that information to you. Yes.
It's going to be a very strange question. Can you talk a little bit about some of the, besides grass and this option, about some other options that obviously your competitors, and can you compare them to grass?
Sure. There's other options out there for infill materials, and Mike is going to talk about infill materials because we have some very interesting data that he can point out here between what you have on natural grass, what you have on a synthetic turf field, and then the divisions in synthetic turf field. We use SBR crumb rubber, which is ground up tires, and sand, and we use that as synthetic soil. If you were to take sand-based Bermuda grass, which is the best natural grass field in the world to play on for sports, and weigh a 12-inch by 12-inch sample, it weighs about 9.25 pounds per square foot. So what we do with our synthetic turf system is we infill that synthetic grass with 9.25 pounds of sand and rubber per square foot. In a typical stadium, you're going to have over 800,000 pounds of material inside that system. And there are other materials out there now, like cork, coconut husk, and rice husk. What happens with those products over time is that there is way more additional maintenance. Because we're going to add 800,000 plus pounds of material to your field, over time, you do not have to replace that material. In fact, in 10 to 12 years, when we come back to replace your field, we recycle 99% of that material back into your new field. Coconut and cork, you have to add between $20,000 and $30,000 per year of additional material to your field. So that's between $200,000 and $300,000 more of your initial $1.2 to $2 million estimate if you go with what we call organic infills. One of the interesting things about organic infills is there's been very little testing on them, and what testing has been done actually shows that they have more polyaromatic hydrocarbons and volatile organic compounds than what you find in SBR rubber. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Mike if there's no other questions. This is Mike Peterson from Gradient Consulting. They're an environmental consulting firm, and he is a certified toxicologist.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I do want to say to start off with, I don't do a ton of these meetings, but I have never before heard general causation and specific causation get brought up. So I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards, because those are very important concepts when you're looking at chemical risk assessment. And chemical risk assessment is a slightly different tool, but that's what I'm mostly going to be talking about today. Just to give you some perspective on my experience in this area, as Bill mentioned, I'm a board-certified toxicologist. I've been working in the field for about 20 years, and I guess my day job essentially entails looking at chemical exposures to humans and trying to figure out if they're going to cause problems. That can be at a Superfund site where you might have contaminated soil. It could be in a situation like Flint, Michigan, where you've contaminated water, or it can be chemical exposures from food or even from consumer products like recycled rubber. Now, my experience specifically with recycled or crumb rubber, whatever we want to call it, started about 2 years ago. Gradient got a call from a local health district in Washington State. They were funding a grant for the construction of several new fields, and we're looking at synthetic turf, and they had some parents who were concerned. They had read things on the web, they had seen stories on ESPN or CBS, and so they called us to do an independent assessment of the literature that was out there, and to also do a preliminary risk assessment to see if there might be any concerns about health. So that was about 2 years ago. About 6 months after we finished that project, I got a call from the Recycled Rubber Council, and they were looking for a scientific advisor to help them in these sorts of areas. So that's my current work in this field, is as a scientific advisor there. Now tonight I'm here on behalf of Field Turf, as you probably figured out. But I can assure you that no matter who I was working for in this particular area, the science did not change. So, to move forward a little bit, this is the first slide I like to show when we start talking about recycled rubber. And we often talk about chemical exposures from recyclable rubber as if in a vacuum. That if we can either play on recycled rubber and have chemical exposures, or we can play on these natural turf fields and have none. And that's not how a toxicologist or risk assessor looks at this. Up on the slide here, I have 3 of the common chemicals we often hear about associated with recycled rubber: arsenic, lead, and PAHs, which are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. All 3 of those compounds are found naturally in the environment. They're found in natural soil. And if you look at the concentrations, we might see, these are just typical ranges, you'll see the concentrations between recycled rubber and natural soil are actually very similar. In some cases, natural soil is actually higher. And I think that provides some context when we start to talk about these chemical exposures. This isn't a chemical exposure or nothing. This is something where we need to know about doses, we need to know about exposure, and we need to know about risk. And I forgot to talk about give you a little heads up on what I'll be discussing today. When I said state of the science, I like to run through some of the basic concepts we go over as a toxicologist. Then I'll be moving into some of the previous research that has been done on this topic. I'll talk a bit about some new studies that have come out. There's actually 3 brand new studies that I'll go over. Then we'll talk about some of the news stories you've probably heard, some of the studies you might have seen online that might have alarmed you. There's a few of them, so we'll talk about those. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the current research that's ongoing at US EPA in California. So that previous scientific literature I mentioned, there are over 100 different studies, reports, regulatory reviews that have been done on recycled rubber and synthetic turf. Over 100. I have the bibliography if any of you want any bedtime reading. That includes 17 different regulatory agency reports. US EPA, Massachusetts Department of Health, Connecticut Department of Health, Cal OHIA, New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. The list goes on. There are more than 24 peer-reviewed scientific studies that have also looked at this issue. Now, of all those 100-some different reports, almost unanimously, they have all found that the best evidence does not point to concerns about health effects. I said almost unanimous. We'll get to the non-unanimous here a little later in the presentation. Now, a number of those studies, apparently I can't work a clicker, also mention that there are limitations. And you'll hear that as a critique of these 100+ studies. And that is absolutely true. Each of these individual studies, when you look at them as a piece of the puzzle, have limitations. Some of them might only look at inhalation exposure. Some of them might only look at ingestion exposure. However, when you look at all the consistency of all those 100 studies that have been done, it really provides a strong basis to make decisions about safety. Now, as I mentioned, we do have some new studies. An excellent one that was just released in December from RIVM. That's basically the Dutch equivalent of their US EPA. Europe is having the same questions about this as are going on in the United States. And they did a very comprehensive evaluation. They went out and sampled 100 different fields and did a risk assessment with that data and came out with a report in December that found that explicitly these fields are safe. They also did something, I'll talk about this concept a little bit, bioavailability. With recycled rubber and even with soil, if we ingest accidentally a little bit of the soil, not 100% of the chemicals in it don't get into our bodies. The percent that gets into our bodies is called the bioavailability. And it's important when we're talking about rubber, because what this study found, which is consistent with several others that also looked at this, is very, very small levels get out of the rubber and either onto our skin or potentially absorbed through our gastrointestinal tract if we get exposed. So that's good news. Now, the second new study, this is not published yet. You'll recognize the name in front of it because my colleagues and I decided to do our own study. One of the big limitations that consistently gets mentioned about the available data is that none of the studies out there, none of those 100+ studies, has looked at all the different routes of exposure at the same time. When I say all those routes, I'm talking about ingestion, I'm talking about skin, I'm talking about inhalation of vapors. None of those look at all of them at the same time. So we decided to do that study. We took and how we got our data, we didn't go out and actually sample. We took all of those 100+ studies and tried to glean the data from those studies to use in our assessment. We ended up using, I believe, some 40-some that had usable data. We pulled all of that data into a large database, and then we evaluated multiple different exposure receptors. We looked at athletes. We looked at spectators. You might have a small kid out there that might eat some of the crumb rubber. We also, one of my co-authors on this, Julie LeMay, her daughter goes to a daycare that has a synthetic turf play area. So we decided to evaluate that as well. So we looked at a bunch of different types of exposures. And when all was said and done, we had close to 200 different recycled rubber samples. We had over 100 air samples taken above these fields. And collectively, those looked at 100 different chemicals. Now, in order to make sure, another concept we often use in risk assessment, and particularly product safety assessment, is we want to be conservative. We want to assume worst-case assumptions because we don't want to underestimate the risk. We're talking about children's health here, so we want to make sure that if we do anything, we overestimate the risk. So we evaluated two different types of individuals. The maximum exposed individual. This person was assumed to essentially spend all of their time on what we called one superfield. Essentially, the maximum concentration of every single chemical in our database was thought or was hypothetically found on one field. And this maximum exposed individual played every single one of their games, every single one of their practices on that field. For that scenario, we also use standard bioavailability assumptions. Now, that first slide I showed talks a little bit about the soil versus rubber. We decided to provide some context for the results of our rubber evaluation. We would also look at soil and run our soil concentrations through the exact same scenario, just to give us something to compare to. And finally, we looked at our reasonable maximum exposure. And instead of using the maximum concentration, we used the average concentration. We also used more realistic bioavailability factors for that evaluation. And essentially, when we use US EPA guidance, this is how US EPA assesses risks. They basically look at both cancer risks and non-cancer hazards. Now, I think you guys can probably see that. Just to orient the chart here a little bit, on the left-hand side is our estimated cancer risk. And the important number there is 1e to the negative 4. Essentially, that's the red dotted line. That is what US EPA considers to be acceptable. Anything below that. And our bars, we have spectator, or the type of receptor along the bottom. And the blue bar is our rubber MEI, the maximum exposed individual. The green is the rubber RME. So that's the more average concentrations. And the reddish brown bar is the soil MEI. So the big picture here, everything is below what US EPA would consider to be an acceptable risk. As expected, you see that the blue bars, the MEI, has slightly higher risk than the RME. That makes sense, blue versus green. Interestingly, you'll see that the rubber MEI compared to the red, the soil MEI, the rubber is slightly higher, pretty much across the board. However, in our world, we'd call those risks pretty consistent. We're seeing similar risks from soil versus rubber. Now, for non-cancer hazards, a similar chart. EPA uses a slightly different scale for this. They assume anything lower than 1 to be acceptable. And you can see, once again, pretty much everything is below what US EPA would consider acceptable. The one exception there is the daycare child's soil MEI calculation came out to be exactly 1. Now, that doesn't mean that we think that there's some hazard for a child at a daycare playing on natural turf. What this illustrates is how conservative or how worst case these assumptions are. They're basically to provide context. The fact that using these worst case assumptions still results in risks and hazards that are lower than what you would find, or lower than what US EPA finds acceptable, gives us some confidence in that analysis. So I mentioned the contrary studies. If all of this looks so good, if all this data says the same thing, then why am I here today? Well, obviously, there's some things out there that have caused some alarm. There's really two primary things, at least in my mind. First, there are these contrary studies. There's 3 of them mentioned here. The biggest issue with these is you remember my remarks about considering exposure and dose. These contrary studies don't do that. They look at the Yale study, as it's sometimes called, and the Lompart study. They found that there were levels of chemicals in recycled rubber, said that that was alarming, and that was it. They didn't do any exposure calculation. They didn't look at risk. So that's really only telling half the story there. And we have a number of studies that have done that. So we know what the risks and doses are. The Italian study, I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail here. If someone has questions, I can go into it. Essentially, they did a preliminary assessment, and we actually included their data in our study, using extreme worst case assumptions, and still we're essentially within the ballpark of what we see as far as acceptable risks. Also, none of these considered bioavailability.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Any questions? Because you said you don't know if anyone has any questions. I don't want to interrupt you.
You can if you want.
So you mentioned, thank you. You mentioned risk, right? So how do you define risk? Is it an odds ratio?
Risk, as defined by US EPA in a risk assessment, is it's the excess cancer risk, well, what they consider acceptable, associated with like a 1 times 10 to the negative fourth would be an excess cancer risk of 0.0001%. 1 in 10,000. So that's how US EPA designs their risk.
So I don't know if that's good or not. I mean, if I think about, standards, right? And you as a toxicologist, I'm sure know this. You think about what the Assistant Secretary of OSHA came out with just 2 years ago. He said, forget all of our standards, right? And I have the transcript from his press announcement just 2 years ago. It's very interesting, right? It's public information.
Oh.
And he said, you can basically forget about all of our standards. They're outdated, and the standards are too low, and you should really pay attention to them. He gave like 3 other sources, right? Like the American ACGIH. He gave California EPA, I think you had it up.
Yep.
And one other organization.
I believe he actually mentioned US EPA as well.
He might have,
Yep.
but I don't know that necessarily there's one definitive, organization that can establish a standard on an emerging risk, is my point. And so I just asked, you to consider it.
Oh, definitely. And actually, that's a very good point, and I didn't do my homework because most states also have acceptable risk standards. I grew up in Minnesota, and ours was 10 to the negative fifth. So that does vary, and I'm not sure what Pennsylvania is. I will definitely get that. Some of them don't have standards and simply default to US EPA. So, but I'm not sure if that's the case here or not. And the other big issue, that is the reason why I'm here talking to you today, is Coach Griffin's list. I assume everyone has heard of the soccer cancer list. This actually is right in my backyard. I'm currently in Washington State, that is. And this list, for those who aren't familiar, Coach Griffin is an assistant soccer coach at the University of Washington. And I think this was 10 or 15 years ago, she started to notice that a number of her soccer players had cancer. So she started to keep a list. And this list got picked up by some of the major news organizations. It's obviously anecdotal in nature, but anytime you hear about a list of children with cancer, that is going to be concerning. So, I'm going to start off here. I'm going to tell you right up front, this is an oversimplified analysis, but I think it provides some context for that number, that 200 number you'll hear. The big reason why it's oversimplified is this list is not public. I don't know what types of cancers are on that list, how old the people were when they got cancer, any of that information which you would really need to do an epidemiology study. But we have some basics. We know there are about 200 athletes. We know they're generally between the age of 5 and 24. And what we can do is a little back of the envelope epidemiology here. There's a background rate of cancer for people of all ages. So we can take that background rate, this is published by the Centers for Disease Control, We can take the number of youth soccer players out there, and we can calculate how many cancer cases we'd expect to see in that population. If we go back 15 years, which is about what Coach Griffin has looked at, we find that we would expect over 21,000 cases of cancer in that population. That's just natural background. So the fact that we find 200 people on a list isn't necessarily surprising. Now, it certainly sounds terrible and it's tragic, but we would actually expect many more. Now, once again, that is oversimplified. The good news is, another one of those new studies. The Washington State Department of Health, like 2 weeks ago, released their own analysis of that list. They had the list. They were able to go and interview all of the players. Well, they didn't get to all of them on that list. They stuck to the Washington State ones. They were able to interview them and do an actual cancer cluster investigation. They found that players on that list actually had less cancer than they would expect. They didn't find any increase in rate. So 2 different ways of looking at this list. Both of them found the exact same thing. And finally, what's ongoing? US EPA, the CPSC, and ATSDR are all doing a large federal study right now. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with that, considering the recent election. We're hopeful that they're going to finish the study, though. However, it's unlikely it would be this year. It would probably be next year before any results would come out of this. Luckily, California is also doing a very comprehensive study. They are planning to release their results come 2019. So unfortunately, nothing in the near term probably other than the Washington and Dutch studies. But sometime in the future, we'll know more. However, I will say, given the 100+ study database out there already, I wouldn't anticipate that these are really going to find some sort of drastically different result. I think that would be unlikely. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Michael, I have a question. Other than Coach Griffin's list, are you aware of any longitudinal studies that have been conducted by any group or organization with any specific sample population in terms of their exposure over time and resultant, not risk, but actual cases of identified cancer as a result of what they presume are carcinogens?
I don't believe that study is out there. It sounds like you have some familiarity with epidemiology studies. So usually, maybe, you sounded good.
I wish I could take that kind of credit that you're giving me, but no, I don't.
Well, most of the time when we're talking about a real epidemiology study like that, either a retrospective or a prospective study, we're talking 20 to, and also if you're talking about cancer, the latency period of cancer can go up to like 30 years. So that's one of the reasons that risk assessment is really the preferred tool when we don't have a 30-year exposure history, because that takes into account those carcinogens and the exposure to them. But as far as I know, no one has done anything like that. It would probably be too soon.
And I guess tied into that would be, how do you extrapolate out what are the causal factors in identified cases down the road as to what led to that diagnosis?
As far as if you were going to design the perfect study? Oh boy, I shouldn't have started down the epidemiology path. It would, like any epidemiology, you essentially have to go with an athlete questionnaire, and essentially as a toxicologist, what you'd want to see to prove kind of a specific causation is you'd want to see that we had a dose-response gradient. So players that only played for 1 year, we didn't see an increase in cancer. Players that played for 5 years, we see a little bit more. Players that played for 20 years, we see a lot more. That's what you'd want to look for. Like I said, though, with the latency period and that sort of thing, it's just not, I don't think anyone's really started down that road.
I have a question. So I was listening to the presentation, and you were kind of talking about like heavy usage of the field versus not so heavy usage of the field. What do you define as heavy usage of the field? Like a student who's on the field every day for practice and games, or?
For our, we would call those our exposure factors. And some of them are defaults that USCPA puts out, like body weights and that sort of thing. For heavy usage, we used what the Connecticut Department of Health, that's one of the organizations that's done one of these studies, we basically mimicked their usage. And I believe that was 5 days a week, 4 practices in a game is what we assumed during the summer. For the daycare child, for example, we assumed 5 days a week because there'd be a daycare 5 days a week. So, and that we actually kept for both the MEI and the RME. We didn't change those. Yeah. Well, believe it or not, I don't get any money from the school district building on this. I'm kidding. No. The vested interest is what I was saying. But at any rate, a couple points to that. The first one, as far as soil being not, or turf being safer than soil, that wasn't really the point of that slide. I frankly, I just think they're both safe. Oh, no, 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 I agree, I agree. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and that's what I was saying. I tried to make this point, but the analysis that include the soil, the MEI, I assume that's what you're talking about, really just included to provide context. I don't think that it had higher, I don't think it probably has higher non-cancer hazards. It's simply that the very worst case assumptions that we use in these types of analyses cause that sort of result. So I don't think there's, as far as I'm concerned, they're both safe. I wouldn't have an issue playing on one versus the other. As far as what the Natural Grass Association would say, I mean, they probably, I think I've covered pretty much all the other sides. I mean, I've done this enough times where pretty much after each presentation, I add, oh, I probably needed to consider that too. So I think I've got them all at this point as far as the contrary evidence, which I think is pretty weak, as you've seen. What any natural grass person would say was that those worst case assumptions aren't realistic for grass. So for instance, we use the maximum concentrations of lead and PAHs, you know, the same thing we did for artificial turf. We use that for soil, and those probably aren't going to be realistic in most cases. So that's what they'd probably say, is that the high ends of our ranges were not really indicative of what you would see in the field.
Are you a PhD?
No, I have a master's. Yeah, that's what I thought.
It's an MEM?
Yes.
What is that?
It's environmental management. It's a professional degree program at Duke University.
Thanks.
So I have a couple clarifying questions.
Sure.
So the non-cancer hazards, can you define those?
Well, in general, what you would do in a full risk assessment is you would split out those hazards by target organ. So they would be, for instance, impacts on the respiratory tract, impacts on the liver, impacts on the kidney. Now what we did, to be conservative once again, is we summed all of those, which essentially is assuming the same target organ is hit with all of those. So supposed to err on the side of safety once again. Now, the specific ones would vary by which chemicals were responsible for where the hazard was, and I'm trying to remember. I believe our highest one was cobalt. The highest chemical contributor was cobalt, which I believe is a kidney. Non-cancer hazard is based on kidney effects, I believe. I can certainly, it's actually our manuscript's in, so if you have more interest in seeing exactly which chemicals are responsible, I'd be happy to send that your way.
Some other clarification. So in the Griffin study, they looked at the risk of cancer only in a group of soccer patients?
They looked at soccer players, because Coach Griffin's list was primarily soccer players. So they looked at, I'm not recalling if they restricted it to soccer players. They restricted it to Washington State residents, which was also the majority of the list because she's in Washington.
So what I want to know is how does that compare to the general population in pediatrics for cancer risk? So I think you need to look at that whole population of cancer risk. And then specifically look at kids that play on turf and then compare those two populations so that you have a better idea of what is the risk.
You're absolutely right. That would be, and that would get to Dr. Hacker, to her point. That would be a real epidemiology study.
So I feel like there's so many unknowns.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have any long-term studies. We don't have any real comparative studies for the general risk of cancer in the population versus kids playing on turf. So it's just, for me, a lot of unknowns. And so I'm not sure we can really safely draw any medical conclusions based on that.
Well, I would say that's true of a tremendous number of things that you encounter in your everyday life that you don't think is a concern. This is essentially how the regulatory agencies determine whether or not something should be allowed into commerce, whether or not something is safe for human use or human consumption. This is a process that used. We haven't done epidemiology studies on every single product out there. In fact, if you have a cell phone case, you probably are touching recycled rubber every single day. Someone's done a risk assessment, but we haven't done an epi study on whether your cell phone cover, there's just not enough time or effort in the world to hit all those.
But there have been enough reports, kids that cough up black matter after being exposed to turf, from all the inhalation injuries. Then you have to wonder, besides cancer, what is the risk to your lung breakdown? That's not looked at either.
Well, essentially, the studies that have done inhalation, taken air samples while people are playing on the fields, and have measured particulate matter, have measured volatile organic chemicals, then compared those concentrations to safe levels, and those safe levels come from long-term animal studies. They could come from epidemiology studies for individual chemicals. When they do that, they find that the exposure levels are below what you would be considered safe. What's that?
I said I'm not convinced.
Well, that's fair.
This whole matter of artificial turf is bringing up a concern that did not exist until you brought up artificial turf. If we just went ahead and kept doing what we're doing, we'd have none of the concerns that seem to be brought up. I'm just wondering, why are we doing this?
As far as
Is it an economic thing? Is it just economics? Is it safety? What is the balance here?
it's definitely beyond my level of expertise, but
Mr. Payne? We actually have a number of reasons why we are exploring the utilization of artificial turf. So I'm going to ask Mr. Payne, who is our athletic director at the high school, because he really has extensively looked at some of the advantages of why artificial turf is used throughout the area, the schools that we play, our competition, and so forth. So Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you if you can address the gentleman's question.
And I don't have these in a priority order,
So some of these things probably deserve to be ranked in a different place that I'll present them to you. But all of these pieces of the puzzle that we kind of put on the table come from a place of our level of competition versus those that we compete against. So one of the hardships that we have athletically here in extracurricular sports, I'll give you, for example, in the spring, we traditionally miss the first 2 weeks of spring season practices being outside. Other schools have, they don't have the melted snow that has turned to mud that makes the surfaces unplayable to start the season. They're outside practicing. We practice every other day in the gym. We find ourselves significantly behind in the beginning of spring season. We have some issues because we have to overlay fields where we lose on-field time simply because we just don't have the versatility on the surfaces we have here to be able to play multiple sports. We run into scheduling conflicts because many of our fields overlap, and the turf would allow us to line them multi-sport, and we could stack them back to back to back. We'd have some versatility and some scheduling relief with an artificial surface. Some of the sports specifically are just played differently on different kinds of surfaces, like field hockey. The ball moves significantly faster on turf versus a natural surface. Of our 22 field hockey games, 11 away games, all 11 of them will be on turf surfaces. Our 11 home games will be on grass. Our team practices on grass. So when we go travel to another school, the game is completely different. We're finding a real drop in our performance in field hockey in terms of surface, the surface in which we play on. There are a number of off-season programs that we are not able to run because of weather conditions and the field surfaces. The artificial surface would unlock those fields at more months of the year where we could participate in preparing for sports seasons. Our PE classes were relegated in many months of the year because of weather to only being indoors. Some of these surfaces would unlock some of those fields outside to expand some of what we do during our school day. We share some fields with both Erdenheim and our community. So Erdenheim during the school day with PE and the community at night. We are, that shared space and that shared time is we're gonna do it because that's what's best for all of us, but it is impacting the availability of those fields for us. And we'll be able to work much faster. So the surface, the playing surface would be more conducive for some sports. The scheduling would relieve a lot of stress for other groups that all use the same surface. We've been in some situations, my first year here, the upper field back behind the maintenance garage was unplayable for the entire spring season. We had to ship our boys lacrosse team to the middle school, which impacted the middle school sports team because that surface just hadn't drained the water and the grass didn't grow. It was an unplayable surface. That put the middle school in a tremendous bind also. So some of these artificial surfaces would help kind of alleviate some of those. I think that we've got a lot of traffic on some limited spaces in this community. And so if we can find a usable artificial surface, we could unlock a lot of those things for our youth programs, our middle school programs, our high school programs. And I think that's a...
Jason, in addition to availability, scheduling, and competitive advantage, can you also address the physicality of the players and how that's impacted by losing actual practice time?
Yeah, I think we're experiencing right from the jump. Most of the teams that are in our conference are significantly larger in student population than us. So right from the jump, we're at a pretty massive disadvantage just in manpower, girl power, right, per sport. I think that some of our sports rosters who are a part of teams that are dwindling a bit, they're less motivated to come out for that sport. So we're losing some of our kids are choosing other things because that particular team is kind of falling down a bit. I think I'm nervous to say that we're going to be able to fully support all of the sports we've been servicing traditionally moving forward if we don't find some ways to kind of creatively close the gap between the competition's facilities and ours. So I also think there's an element of this, if you look at I'm very interested when I see the comparisons between soil and artificial surfaces, because it should always matter in context of where. I mean, our natural grass surfaces aren't comparable to the Eagles field. I don't know how many millions of dollars they spend to maintain that, but that surface is not comparable to what we have here. And as a former athlete and still a current athlete, I'd rather play on grass if it was maintained like Lincoln Financial Field, right? So in context to what? If you look at our field hockey field, forget about the ball speed of the play. There's the unevenness and of the physical surface, which is inherent with any natural surface. None of them are going to be completely flat. And I think that there can be some risk and some injury risk to surfaces that aren't flat. We can kind of, my presumption, and this is more for these guys than me, is the artificial surface would also be more consistent in terms of its grade, which I think is as a health benefit for us, is having the grade consistency. I look at the soccer goals, where our soccer goalies stand, that goal mouth. In 3 to 4 days of summer camp, we have worn that grass out. There is no more grass. Those goalies diving on the ground, they're not diving on grass. Right? The traffic there is too high for a natural surface. So what they're impacting on is different than other sports or other players on a soccer field. This would help alleviate some of that. We won't have that just, barren, hard dirt surface when we go through droughts and it's not soft. Is that helpful? Okay. Yeah, it's all. I think that this stuff is good, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation. These are the kinds of the things that we've been talking about as we were weighing all these options.
I would just like to back you up just a moment. I've been on the board for 6 years and on the property committee for that whole time. And I know that we have always struggled with the wear and tear of our fields. We just don't have enough fields for the amount of teams and community members that use them. And it's just impossible to keep up with the maintenance necessary. Like Jason said, a couple weeks and there's no more grass on the field, but we still have to use it. There's no time to reseed. There's always a big line item in our facilities budget for maintaining fields, and you just get to the point where you feel like you're throwing good money after bad, just trying to keep it at least a little bit playable. So I think that our consideration of turf has been ongoing for at least the time that I've been on the board. And it seems like to alleviate some of the stress on the field by having 1 or 2 fields being turf is really the way that we need to be moving at this point.
Yeah, and we've tried to be creative with other things. We moved the goals so that we're still always wearing the same place out. But at some point, you move the goals to as many places as you can move them, and you've worn out all of the spots. Or logistically, they have to be so far from a certain place. There are certain spots you can't rotate to. So we've been trying to troubleshoot this in other ways. But as this project started to take shape, this seemed like a good part of the conversation to put on the table.
So, Jason, I'm going to relieve you and get you off the hook, but I'm going to put somebody else on the hook at this point. Mr. Schrader, if you don't mind, you build schools all over the Commonwealth. So can you speak to how schools are approaching you in your capacity as an architect, and what considerations? I'm sure you've heard similar discussions. What are they thinking about when they talk to you about the viability of using turf as opposed to a grass field?
Okay. It's actually a very direct answer to the question, and that is what's happened over the last 15 years in sports. And what's happened in the last 15, I guess, to 20 years in sports at the collegiate level, the secondary level for schools, is that you have increased the number of sports, you have increased female sports, so you've multiplied the use of the fields out there, you've increased the length of year of your practice time and your play time, and ultimately all of that has created a situation where the schools that used to have a certain size plot of land to build their building on and then play a given number of sports has had to almost double the quantity of places that they need to play these things. And so how have the schools reacted? They've actually reacted by saying, what do I do to make multi-use of that? And the multi-use is to create some kind of field that has the capability of handling 3 sports played on it a day, or 3 practice sessions a day, or 7 days a week because the community's using it too. So ultimately, that's the reason why you're seeing these fields being used, because otherwise we'd all love to play on a well-manicured grass field. So that ultimately is what we see our clients coming to us for. The next question then beyond that is, how much more does it cost me to have that artificial field than a regular field? And that's where those cost comparisons come in when you start saying number of times used a week times X number of days a year that it's used, and then ultimately how much does it cost to try to maintain a field of that quality. And I think I'm not the guy to answer those. Definitely the artificial turf folks have those comparisons. I think a number of those comparisons have been pretty well vetted by this point. And as long as you're saying that you're doing the comparison over the length of life of an artificial turf field, a 10-year or a 2-time replacement of 20-year, then the numbers are comparable and you can actually make a reasonable comparison. If you try to draw a conclusion at 5 years and say, how much did it cost me at the end of 5 years? Well, that's not the end of the life of the artificial turf field, so it's not a fair comparison. So I just wanted to say, by the way, I didn't know I was going to say anything here. I have no dog in this game. We are interested, Mr. Bissinger and ourselves, in getting your site redeveloped the way that the site ultimately should be redeveloped at this point. How many playing fields you have that are turf versus natural, that's really a decision to be made amongst all of you folks, and we'll just implement whatever decision is made. So it always comes down to this incredible use that these fields are starting to see for the size of the plots that the schools have in the area. That's the long and short of my answer.
Dr. Hacker, or Gretchen, may I ask the gentleman who asked the last question a question? Because, I'm sorry, I have a feeling that your question wasn't only about safety, but also about the concern about the cost of the turf field versus the grass field. Am I correct?
Safety and cost.
Yeah. And I don't know if the cost factor, I think it was addressed in more global terms, that over the long term, based on how much more frequently we'll be able to use the turf field, versus how much less frequently we'll be able to use the grass fields because they're out of commission. Dollar for dollar will probably work out to be the same, but I appreciate your question about, it's a pretty large initial outlay. But if I may, from my point of view as to why I think it's important is because I think our community, Springfield, we have fabulous schools. I'm very biased, both my kids go here. But I think we have fabulous schools, and I think it's our responsibility to make sure that our facilities continue to attract new families into the community, because I think that will actually support, obviously, the real estate prices, et cetera, to make it a more inviting and appealing community for new families to move into. So from my perspective as to why a turf field can potentially, and I'm not 100% sold on it, but why it would make sense to me is I think because our facilities need to keep up with what young families expect to see in suburban communities such as ours. I don't know if that kind of addresses that, but I just wanted to give you my perspective.
You know, if I may, I don't mean to being on the board, right, so our primary or your primary interest would be the interests of the school and the students as opposed to real estate values.
No, I mean, we pay taxes. So, I mean, it is, I mean, for me, it's.
Okay, no, I appreciate
my
you.
real estate taxes increasing versus facilities. So, I think all of us, most of us have kids currently in school.
Right.
So I think, all of us sitting today here have kids in school. So I think we all take tax rates into consideration. We understand that there are a lot of residents in the township who don't necessarily have kids in school and
for adding that, because I'm new to this and I don't understand a lot of parts. But at the same time, maybe it's not sort of binomial. Maybe there's kind of a third leg to this chair, you know, and maybe a fourth. So it might not be, you know, you invest in this technology, this turf, it's more expensive, taxes go up, but, you know, you get more people in the neighborhood because at higher prices, you know, and so forth, and you can spread the cost of this. One option is, and I'm not lobbying for this, but one theoretical option is sports just gets less weight. Sports is less important. All of the time, effort, and energy that one would want to put into sports and the availability that folks would want to have for it, it just isn't realized because of trade-offs in the interest of the balance that you're, and I think we're all looking for, you know, and I'm not saying I have your answer or anybody else's answer here, but rather that there are different ways to approach it, and that it might not just be A or B, there might be a third or fourth option as well.
How does the turf field impact the equipment, like football jerseys and helmets? Is that any different than the grass surface?
That's an interesting question because uniforms are much cleaner on synthetic turf than they are on natural grass. But you still have to wash them, right? You're not going to let your athletes play and practice all week in a jersey without washing it, whether they play on synthetic turf or whether they play on natural grass. But uniforms tend to last longer because you don't have to use harsh chemicals on them to get rid of a grass stain.
I have two questions. I have one for you and one for Dr. Acker. I'll start with you. Can you elaborate on bloodborne pathogens, MRSA, skin infections for turf? I know it's
I can.
something that goes under the radar because everybody looks at the cancer-causing things, but those are significant issues that are coming.
Are you familiar with Penn State University's turf grass management program? It's world-renowned. Professor Andy McNitt couldn't be here tonight. I was going to bring Andy with me tonight. He has done extensive studies on MRSA, staph, bloodborne pathogens, and none of them live on synthetic turf when it's outside. If you were to build a dome here over your stadium, then you would have to use chemicals on your synthetic turf because it was not in the direct sunlight. So as long as these fields are in sunlight and they get rain on them, pathogens do not live in them. Staph and MRSA have always been found on your wrestling mats that are in your gym and also in your locker rooms because kids share towels. So if you want the link to Professor McNitt's study, I'd be more than happy to provide that to the board, and then they can post it on the website. It's a very interesting study, and Andy McNitt was even surprised at the results that he got from that.
Dr. Hacker, can you give us the financials again for the district of how much funding did we put into education and what the difference is between sports and the school district?
I don't have the numbers offhand. I can tell you that approximately 85% of the students at the high school participate in some form of athletics and/or extracurricular activity. And out of that 85%, approximately 40% play more than one sport. I don't have the exact breakdown offhand, but I can get that in terms of what our budget, what percentage of our budget and what the exact dollars are that go towards our athletics department. Athletics are a fairly substantial portion, as I just mentioned, of daily life here at the high school. For lion's share of our students at the high school, they spend many, many hours beyond the 6.5, 7-hour academic day on our fields well into the evening throughout the entire school year. So a significant number of our student population plays at least one sport, and many others play 2 or more. Again, I apologize, I don't have the financials in front of me, but I certainly can get that for you, Mike.
If I remember from the last meeting we had, you said something, and I'm just going to shoot a number out there. Say that the amount of funding that goes into education is somewhere to mean, take a rough number, $1 million. But the amount of funding that actually goes into sports in general for Springfield is $200,000. So there's a drastic difference between the amount of money we're putting into sports.
Yeah.
So with the amount of money, with that small amount that we're putting in, with the improvements that we're looking forward to, if I remember correctly, one of the big challenges is that the fact that we cannot retain our residents in our school district. They're going to the private schools that have the facilities to entreat these children, for their parents to go spend another $50,000 for them to go to that school for maybe not education, but most of the parents whose kids are very athletic, the path to college is through sports. And that's why they're choosing to take their kids away from Springfield. So if I'm correct, is the improvements are to keep the kids here, not to lose them.
There are a number of factors, and you just cited two of them. One, of course, is scholarships. There's a huge amount of scholarship money out there that colleges are offering for athletes who are trained on the fields as well as indoors, whether it's basketball, whether it's football, whether it's indoors or outdoors. So obviously, when a student here at Springfield Township High School has the potential to excel, at a very competitive level, particularly when our neighborhood schools are offering that competitive advantage, which is one of the things I asked Mr. Payne to speak to. If they're able to practice 2-3 weeks more than our students are able to practice, they have a competitive edge going into the season. The teams are going to do better. More scouts are going to come from the colleges to look at those athletes and potentially offer them spots on their teams in college. So that is definitely one aspect of it. The other, if you recall from that meeting, you might recall there was a woman who is now a parent here in Springfield who used to be on the admissions committee determining admissions criteria for Springside Chestnut Hill. And one of the factors that she was pointing out is that by beefing up their athletic facilities, they are indeed, as you mentioned, able to attract better athletes. We know that's true, for example, with LaSalle, with their golf team, with their sports teams that are outside as well. So we are surrounded, we are in a very unique position in this community that we're surrounded by the Mount. We've had parents coming in at 9th grade at our open houses who are very critically looking at what do we offer, and they're looking at not only our academic programs but our athletic programs as well. One of the parents who just came to our open house is the parent of a swimmer who's seriously considering the Mount as opposed to our high school, and we're trying to convince them, obviously, to send their student here. Not only do we want to see students within our own community coming here, as opposed to Germantown Academy, Germantown Friends, LaSalle, the Mount, the parochial schools, because we simply want to have a more vibrant student body and not lose not only the best academic students, but the best athletes as well. But it's also money for our school district. We get more state aid and more funding on the basis of the number of students who come into the high school. So it actually benefits us in terms of the more students that we can keep here, the more funding we actually get. The other point that I want to make is that when you look at the cost of an athletic program, and I think an excellent question was asked in terms of how much is all of this costing, we have to focus on what does it cost us to maintain our fields every single year, not only in terms of insecticides that are put down, watering the grass seed, but also raking, mowing, lining the fields, and so forth. All of those are factors going into the daily upkeep of our fields in order to prepare them for our athletes to play. It includes replacement of soil when the fields are worn down. That's an annual cost every single season that we are making. And I think Dave did a very nice job of pointing out that the upfront cost, and I do want to put a number to it because we've been looking at those numbers and we've estimated it is at the lower end of what Mr. Bamber actually predicted when he talked about a $1.2 million up to $2 million cost. We are looking at the lower end of that number for the field that we are thinking of putting into the football stadium. That's over a 10-year period. So when you think about, as Dave mentioned, the annual cost of what it costs to actually pay for that field, we're actually on a yearly basis over the cost of all the seasons when we're using that, investing similar costs in terms of maintenance of our fields. Jason.
Just a side point,
not straight. Our athletic budget number is not only going to show you extracurriculars. Some of that money is also happening within our curricular school day. So it's not extracurricular only, exclusively, which I think is important to know too. So I don't know what the numbers off the top of my head either, but it's not just extracurricular.
No, but I think it's a fair point, Jason, to point out that all of our athletic facilities, both indoors and outdoors, are used by our entire student body here at the high school.
I just have one more question. For turf, I mean, it's been around for, I guess, about 30 years now, since it's been first developed. How has the technology changed? Has it become safer, so to speak, with now that you have environmentalists and toxicologists who can, get involved with everything? So how has it changed from where it was before? I mean, over time, is it becoming more safe? Is there more technology being developed to make sure that, these toxins are being kept to a minimal?
Well, if you remember the stuff that I played on, and you probably played on, it was just a carpet over a pad, which was over concrete, right? So the product has come such a long way from that, where you're not going to get brush burns and torn ACLs to the same extent that you would get them on what they used to have at Veterans Stadium. And I always tell this story about there was I think it was Willie Gault from the Bears, the Chicago Bears, played a game in 1985 at Veterans Stadium. And he went out for a pass, and he blew out both ACLs when he made a cut in the carpet. There wasn't an eagle within 10 yards of him. So the systems now are designed to play more like natural grass, where you can wear whatever cleats you would wear on natural grass. There's no additional expense for your athletes. They wear whatever cleat they wear on natural grass that they're comfortable with. They wear that on synthetic turf. So field turf is designed to emulate sand-based Bermuda grass, which if you ask anyone in the world, what is the best natural grass surface to play on, it's sand-based Bermuda grass. And what sand-based Bermuda allows you to do is it's a fast and firm surface, but it's also, for impact, it's not harmful to your athletes, and it's not harmful on your body, your lower extremities particularly, and this is really getting into what the Dr. Myers study said, is that the old carpet, when you would make a plant and cut, there was so much torque exerted on your knees that there was a higher incidence of ACL tears. So that's called a third-degree injury. Any injury that is over 6 months in time to recover from is called a third-degree injury. Third-degree injuries on the new version of synthetic turf are exactly what they are on natural grass. And these are contact injuries, right? You always worry about non-contact injuries, but contact injuries are typically where these happen. So the incidence and mechanisms for those are the same, natural grass and the new synthetic turf versus the old stuff. Now, there are schools out there that want to play on the old stuff. I mean, at the NCAA level, field hockey is played on short pile carpet with no infill over a pad. That's what they want to play on. But for a high school, you definitely need to have a product that's at least 2 1/4 inches in pile height with a minimum of 7 pounds of sand and rubber per square foot. That is how you're going to emulate natural grass, and your athletes are going to be safe with regards to third degree and lesser injuries.
On the chemical side of that, we haven't really done a longitudinal analysis to see if things are getting better. Just off the top of my head, I think the pH levels do seem to be coming down. The one big difference that, is evident is the very first where this issue came from back in 2007 was a field in New Jersey that was found with extremely high lead levels. And that ended up being not the rubber, it was a lead-based paint that was used on the field. And I haven't seen anything like that in any of the data I've seen over the last 10 years. So that particular health and safety issue appears to have been cleaned up.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? No? Okay. So I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you very much for all of your time, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Yes, I'm not closing out the meeting. I'm just closing out the turf discussion. So I think if we're good, we'll move on But again, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for a very informative discussion. I appreciate it. Okay, thank you. So the next item on our agenda would be public comments on non-agenda items, and we do have a resident who has signed up to come up and speak. And if you could just tell us your name and your address, please.
My name is Norman Auerbach, and I live at 105 Rohrer Street in Erdenheim. I just want to ask some questions about the proposed new school that's going to go up on top of Penn Manor. And I was wondering, is there some kind of public input that we can have on this besides this meeting? Is there going to be a general meeting about the construction of that school?
We actually are going to be going out to the public with public meetings within approximately 1 month.
Okay.
We have had some initial discussion, but we plan to actually, on a monthly basis, begin to hold community forums to actually talk about the school and the work that we've been considering so far up until this point.
Okay. I took a walk, just to put this out, I took a walk around the current Penn Manor School. From the outside, it looks in terrific shape. I don't know what it's like inside, and I'm just wondering what the cost differentials are between the new school and rehabbing the old school.
Well, the problem with Penn Manor is, first of all, the entire roof system is failing terribly. We've been patching leaks for the past several years, and the roof is really becoming untenable in terms of sustaining it currently. So that would be a several $million investment just for the roof alone. The current school actually has been retrofitted. Antonelli, the current lease occupant, is a graphic arts and photography school. So they have actually retrofitted the interior of the school in order to have photography labs and dark rooms and so forth in order to foster their academic program. To reposition the school in order to accommodate the intended grade levels that we would need. Number one, the school is not large enough to accommodate those grade levels, and number two, it would be a significant cost in order to retrofit the school. In order to be able to provide, we'd have to build a new cafeteria for the level, a new gym space for the level, and so forth. Currently, the school doesn't have all the facilities that we would need for a K-1-2 building. One of the major reasons that we're designing the new school as a K-1-2 is because our enrollments have really surged in the district at the elementary level. We are seeing more and more students coming in every single year. From 5 years ago, when we started with an elementary population at Enfield of approximately 165 children per grade, we're now at over 210 students per grade at Enfield, which is just K-1. We don't really have enough room for them now in Erdenheim, even though Erdenheim was just built. You may be aware, we just added on to the cafeteria because we couldn't fit the children in one grade level in the cafeteria. So the design of the new building is designed to relieve some of that stress on Erdenheim and to take one of the grades out of Erdenheim and put it into a new K-1-2 building. So I know that deviates a little bit from your question at Antonelli, but in order to fit those 3 grade levels, which obviously we now need to do, that current building would not be large enough. So I guess in sum, the easiest way to answer your question is by the time we added on what it would take to accommodate the K-1-2 population, to include the areas that that current space does not have, such as a gym to accommodate the children as well as community activities, which we'd like to be able to do as well since we don't have enough indoor gym space, to retrofit the building, to put a brand new roof on, to repair the boiler system, which would also be needed. It would cost very close to what it's costing to build a brand new school.
Would you be able to retain some of the environment, the great trees that are around the school?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question because we've had extensive discussions and we've actually looked very closely with a number of community members, parents who are engineers, architects, landscape designers. We've looked at staff members. Some of the board members have been a part of those conversations as well. And that's very much our intent. Our intent is really to try to maximize the footprint of the area so that we retain the beautiful areas surrounding. We want to keep, obviously, the view from Skyline Drive because we know we have residents who are going to be having to look down on that property as well. We want to maintain that corner area that abuts from Paper Mill Road onto Montgomery Avenue, so that is not populated with areas of the building. We want to keep it the way it is now. We want to keep the area along the side where the farm is to the left so that we have trees there as well. So we're very much trying to keep the landscape design not just intact, but actually improve it to the greatest extent.
Will there be plans available?
Yes, absolutely. The architects are working on that. That's some of the design work that I talked about that we've had input into already. And when we have our community meetings, we're obviously going to be sharing all of that as well. Okay. So we'll publicize those in the enterprise. That's the easiest way for us to get the information out to residents who may not check our website. We recognize that not everyone logs on to our school district website, but the enterprise goes to all homes. So I'm happy to take your personal information and make sure you get an email when we schedule the first meeting.
That's okay. I think we get the enterprise, so we'll get that.
Keep your eyes out. It'll be probably sometime around the end of March.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
Since we live right there and our property backs the hill.
Are you together?
Yes.
Okay.
Would you mind coming up so we can hear you? No, I'll just talk. We won't hear me, I promise. All right, I'm just mostly concerned because it's the back of my property. And there's this lovely hill, who's mentioned the Skyline Drive, okay. Are you doing anything to the hill that goes down to Penn Manor? Will there be 22 school buses there, which I saw in an architect's drawing, but that disappeared?
So what we are planning to do at the current time, and we've looked very carefully at where the buses will be staged, is have an entrance off of Paper Mill Road with a bus loop, but that will not be on the hill. Only part of the loop will be on the hill, and that's only for the buses when they enter in the morning and when they leave in the afternoon with the children. They will not be staged there at all at the hill. So it is, we will have a parking lot to the left of the property which borders the farm, and it is possible that there will be some buses that will be staged there overnight, but they will not be at where the hill is. The actual physical site of the school is being designed on different levels so that it blends into the actual back part of the hill along with play areas for the children. Buses will not be back there.
Are there playgrounds to be there?
There will be a playground in the back of the building on one of the
What area?
levels.
Paper Mill or toward Roar Street?
Well, right now we're looking at, and this is not definitive yet, but one of the things that we're looking at is a play area within the bus loop, and we're also looking at one right outside of the bus loop that actually would be around the back of the building by the hill.
Because the hill, I think, has been very important to people, both the hills, the one where they all, go sledding, the one that backs my property. But that drawing that I saw, my street wasn't even on it.
I don't know what...
it was on the internet. That's how I only know about 22 small buses.
Okay. No. What?
One of the very, very early.
That might have been an early rendering. Yeah.
You know what, I think it was the feasibility study.
Yeah, that could have been the early feasibility study, but that's not an actual rendering of what we've been talking about since then.
And who owns the field that I'm talking about?
That's all school district property.
School district.
Yes.
And how much open space is being lost? Because aren't we all supposed to, save for open space?
We were trying to, that's what I was explaining to your husband, that, for example, that corner where there's a field, that area is going to remain. We're basically occupying a significant amount of the existing footprint, and obviously we are going to increase the space of the school behind that. I don't have the square footage in front of me, but we are trying to maintain a significant amount of the open space, especially on the hill.
Yeah, but see, that's my problem, because my garage, everything right there. I'm sure our whole neighborhood knows nothing.
And that's why we're going to be having the meetings.
People out tonight,
Yeah.
but they're not here.
Yeah.
But they don't know about it. That's the point.
And that's why we're going to be having the community
But you all make
meetings.
decisions before you let everybody know what's going on, to even have their input.
Well, we've had a significant number of public meetings where we've actually talked about the plans for the
I
building.
wouldn't know that. So my concern, yes, is that it doesn't ruin my property, that I don't get a big water problem, because it is a big runoff, and it keeps right on going all the way down to Bethlehem Pike.
Well, stormwater management, as you heard this evening, not only for the high school projects, but also for the elementary school project, and we actually have met with the township to discuss this with them as well, is a significant aspect of that project, is managing that.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
I just want to tell you that I am an artist and a designer, and I've been involved with this project. And we have been very specific in the architect that we hired. He is very concerned with environmental issues, and I know that one of the things that is very important to us aesthetically is to make sure that we plan this building to fit in the neighborhood, to make the site even better than it is now. So I just want to assure you that we're considering what it's going to look like, how much of the land it's going to take up, and absolutely how it will impact the neighborhood surrounding it is very top of mind for
I would
us.
really like to see the architect's drawing.
I think there's some presentations on the website, if I'm not wrong.
We haven't put anything up recently with the specific
for this
renderings, but
building.
that's
Okay.
going to be part of the first community meeting that I mentioned.
Before everything is decided, I hope.
No, we're going to present what the ideas are that have come forward up until this point, with the idea of soliciting input from additional members of the community. Many of the people who have been on the design team that Ms. Lipinski referenced have been members of the community. We've had a very large group that has given their input. Many of them are parents, some of them are not, but we will obviously have more community input into the project.
All right, so what happens is what's called the path that goes up there. Is that what happens right in that area?
I'm not familiar with where you're referring to, ma'am.
Right off of Yakel and Roar, there is the path that the students used to when they went to Penn Manor when it was a school. They used that to get there from the neighborhood.
I apologize, but I'm not familiar with where that's located.
Mm-hmm. It was used when Penn Manor was in existence, because my kids went there. It's right off of Yakel. Yeah, what's going to happen right in that area? See, I don't really understand quite what you're saying, where everything's going to be.
I think the best thing to do is, in addition to the meetings that are going to start fairly soon, where you will be able to actually look at the drawings, because for me, the best thing to do is to see something in the pictures.
I would like to see that.
We also have committee meetings, which at different times touch on different aspects of the project, and they're open to the public. So.
But you have to know about them. Okay.
Well advertised. I don't know how else we do it. But they're all publicly advertised meetings, so my suggestion is either go on our website or I'm sure all we announce them every meeting.
And is that here?
After every board, at the end of every board meeting, we announce the upcoming meetings, and these board meetings are shown on, like, they're broadcast
Mhm.
on the
Cable channel. Mhm.
So, and our agendas are always posted on the website, and they always contain the meeting dates as well.
Okay.
You can go to the website and look every week and see what's coming up, and that's a good way to find that information. And also, we do have
Yes, I am deeply concerned because it could very well affect my property. Okay? And if I don't want to see 22 buses parked against my garage.
I would be happy if you would come to our
Mhm.
community meeting and give your input.
Okay. Yes, but I really feel that, the neighborhood was totally unaware, pretty much. Okay? And it affects them all. It will affect property values. We already have the big bus depot right down at the duck pond is what we call it, okay? And to get more buses parked there, when we do have a property where we're parking Cheltenham buses, we've got to think about that too. What was that? No, I know that. No. But I'm just saying rather that we should be using that property in Orland for Springfield Township. Okay, that's about what I have to say. And I'll be at the meetings. And if I have any chance to see the architect's drawing earlier, just to give me an up so I know what I'm doing too. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Does anyone else have any public comments? Okay, so we're going to close our meeting tonight and thank all of you for being with us. Covered a lot of important topics, and it's good to see residents come out and see what's going on, honestly. Okay, so future meeting dates. The interim board meeting will be Tuesday, March 7th, 2017 at 7 p.m. in the Freeze Memorial Lobby. This meeting is marked tentative, dependent on if we have any board business that evening. The school board meeting will be Tuesday, March 21st, 2017 at 7 p.m. in the Freeze Memorial Lobby. Board committees, there'll be an Academic Affairs Committee meeting on Monday, February 27th, 2017 at 5:30 p.m. at the Administration Building. And there will be a Property Committee meeting on Thursday, March 2nd, 2017 at 8:15 a.m. in the Administrative Building. And that is it. Thanks, everyone. Motion to adjourn.